Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Getting Wise About Getting Old, Debunking Myths About Aging, a book launch and panel discussion hosted by Engage, Concordia Center for Research on Aging. I would like to begin this event by acknowledging that first, Concordia University is located in unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and the waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. Colonialism confounds chronology, and as such, we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Although this talk is taking place on the unceded land of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, many of you are not watching from Montreal, so we invite you to reflect with us for a moment upon the lands and histories where you find yourself now. Thank you, and thank you for your presence. My name is Tristana Martin Rubio, and I'm the coordinator of Engage at Concordia Center for Research on Aging. I will be your moderator for the afternoon's event. A few announcements before we begin. First, this talk is being recorded and the video will be archived on the Engage YouTube channel. The recording will only include footage of our panelists speaking, and any questions posed to the panelists by audience members will be anonymous unless you explicitly state to have your name included with your question. Second, we invite and encourage you to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you have for the panelists. Please feel free to submit those questions at any point during the course of the event. We also encourage you to use other social media platforms beyond the Zoom webinar, and you can find us on Twitter at engage_CU. We are very excited that you are all here today, and we're looking forward to the discussion that will follow. A note about the event before we proceed. The event will first begin with a brief introduction to the book, Getting Wise About Getting Old, Debunking Myths About Aging, followed by the presentations of some of our contributors to the book, Dr. Patrick Marier, Daniel Dixon, Constance Lafontaine, and Dr. Kim Sawchuk. Each presenter will present their work for approximately 5 to 7 minutes, and following their presentations, the floor will be open to questions and for discussion. Today, we are celebrating the launch of Getting Wise About Getting Old, Debunking Myths About Aging, edited by Véronique Billet, Patrick Marier, and Anne-Marie Seguin, published by the University of British Columbia Press. Released in October of this year, Getting Wise About Getting Old challenges myths associated with aging by demonstrating how the difficulties faced by older adults are neither reducible to the passage of chronological time or to natural givens, but are rather encountered by older adults from within the systems, often ageist, of their very own culture. Getting Wise About Getting Old adopts a critical stance towards aging and ageism through a careful interdisciplinary treatment of at least 28 stereotype meanings around aging, from the myth of the cougar to digital ageism to older adults as uniquely recalcitrant to change. The book is divided into 6 parts: the portrayals and realities of aging, its living environments, different aging experiences, social rules, death and bereavement, and caregiver support. And each chapter seeks to provide answers to becoming wise to the elements of ageism that pervade, often in insidious ways, our many perceptions, our feelings, our personal lives, our commonplace language and public discourse, and social and political institutions about getting old, aging, and later life. Getting Wise About Getting Old bucks ageist bias with scientific integrity, data, analysis, and first-person testimony of older adults to offer a more descriptively honest and complex account of aging that renders visible older adults not as a homogeneous group, but rather as heterogeneous. That is, as personally, culturally, politically, and intersubjectively complex individuals with their own points of view, their own worldviews, and their own responses to the terms of their own lives and situations. A more accurate depiction of these heterogeneous lives is an ethical commitment to encountering older lives as they are, and a political commitment to the imperative that older lives matter. In this light, the book is a good resource for interdisciplinary and interprofessional audience, from activists to researchers, students, teachers, public policymakers, and politicians. So to explore some of the elements of ageism, we're fortunate to have with us here today 4 of the book's contributors who also happen to be members or affiliates of the center. Patrick Marier, whose presentation will focus on the myth of the affluent senior, Dr. Kim Sawchuk and Constance Lafontaine, whose joint presentation will focus on what they call digital ageism, and Daniel Dixon, whose presentation will focus on the myth of the eternal child that is correlated to aging individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. After the 4 panelists have spoken, we'll open the floor to questions and panel discussion. And just a reminder, you can submit those questions in the question and answer box at the bottom of the page. So we'll start with Patrick Marier, whose presentation derives from his chapter in the book, Living on Easy Street, The Myth of the Affluent Senior. Dr. Marier is a professor at Concordia University. His research focuses on the impact of aging populations on a number of public policy fields, including pensions, healthcare, and labor policies across comparative cases. He is the scientific director of CREGES, a university research center housed at the Integrated Health and Social Services University Network for West Central Montreal, and he's the lead researcher for the FQRSC, Team Aging, Social Exclusion, and Solidarities. Please welcome Dr. Marier to the virtual floor.
Thank you, Tristana, and thank you to Engage for organizing this event. So we're very happy to have the opportunity to share some portions of the book with you today. I'd like maybe to start quickly with, I will share my screen a bit with a quick overview on the origin of this book. Really came as a source of frustrations with, can we confirm that you see it quite well? Yes, now I guess you see it, right? Yes. So a lot of frustration if you look at a lot of studies have been done in communication and media analysis that shows and clearly that we don't talk enough about aging and older adults in general. And when we do, we tend to have a very dichotomous image of either they're extremely frail and can hardly get around, or they run marathons, right? So in fact, we lose a broad scope of the heterogeneous dimensions, heterogeneous realities of seniors. And as a result, we thought that as scholars, we also had a mission in some ways to actually demystify some of these realities. And as a result, we launched a call to scholars on aging in Quebec and see who would want to contribute to such a book. And then we had such an overwhelming response in French and that we opted to do an English version, which we've released a few months ago now. It's also important to note this is one of the very rare books that specifically talked about Quebec in English in Canada. So there are very few like this. And in fact, so we're actually quite happy to be able to actually have these contributions because in many cases, and as we are scholars in Concordia, the Anglophones in Montreal and the province tend to be forgotten. So we hope in this way that we can increase their visibility and raise the understanding about what their living experiences. So without further ado, I will be talking about one of the chapters that I contributed to, which is Living on Easy Street. So the myth of the affluent senior. And in fact, there's a lot of media representation. So in the book, I mentioned 2 of them. One, which is this very famous article in Libération, a French daily, that pretty much says that the baby boomers are the spoiled children, of retirement. And in the book, I also talked about a housing and cottage shows where they talk about all these baby boomers coming out of the woodworks. So it's no longer just buying a cottage, it's about buying a luxury cottage. It's a huge untapped market. And this representation in stories contribute to vehicle the idea that actually seniors are quite wealthy citizens. So then, we first started with the questions, well, why do people think, or why do media constantly portray this idea that seniors are living in wealth? Well, part of the element behind that answer is we have to go back in time. So historically, retiring equaled living in poverty. So in many cases, actually, if we go prior to World War II, you were simply not retiring in many cases, or if you were retiring, you were staying at your home, you had very limited access to income. So in 1951, for instance, 2/3 of seniors had an annual income below $1,000. So that's equivalent to $9,500 today. So, and that progressed all the way into the 1970s. This is what's at the origins of many of these senior discounts we see today, right? So we lowered the price of ticket buses because we assumed that seniors were actually extremely poor. But then what we saw as a result of the history and the development of the Canadian pension system is that there have been more and more programs that actually supplemented the income of older adults. So we had in the early 1950s, the creation of the old age security pension, which actually drawbacks from earlier program. And then in the late 1960s, we developed the Canadian Pension Plan and the Quebec equivalent. And in 1967, what was meant to be a transition program, aligned with the maturity of the Quebec Pension Plan and the Canada Pension Plan, was the Guaranteed Income Supplement that became so popular, and we realized there were so many other gaps that there were a lot of pressures, and it remains to this day. And still, what is a social assistance program now covers 1/3 of the retirees. So 1/3 of retirees receive some money from the GIS, so either in full or portions of it. And then we still have an important role for private savings in Canada, because our system is the Canada Pension Plan aimed to cover 25% of the average wage of somebody who's worked 40 years. So if you do the Canada Pension Plan with the old age security, we're talking about 40% replacement wage for the average wage worker. So in sum, you need private savings or you need other type of pension plan in order to actually to have a much higher retirement income in Canada. So the first important element to notice is that if we look at the actual income of seniors, it's quite striking that the median older adult is actually not that wealthy. In fact, if you look at the total average total after-tax income of men is about $32,000. And if you split by age, which actually, if we go higher and higher up in age group, you see these income actually can decline quite substantially. But in Quebec, based on the data from 2010, so the average total after-tax income is slightly above $23,000 a year. So this is better than 1951, but this is far from being considered wealthy. And what's also interesting, and this is discussed in the book, and if you start to look at seniors in terms of different categories and groups. So if you look, for instance, women who are above the age of 75 are extremely high risk of poverty, and they tend to actually rely on the guaranteed income supplement more than 2 times more than men. And immigrants are also another group that have a lot of income gaps due to the construction of our pension system. For instance, the old age security, it's based on residency, so you have to reside in Canada for a 40-year period in order to get it. So if you immigrated in Canada and let's say when you were 40 and you retire at 65, you're gonna get 25/40th of actually the old age security. And it's the same thing, because if you are looking at the contribution you're gonna have to the Canada Pension Plan, you're gonna have half a career. So the multiple, if you combine the effect on all of these programs, at the end of the day, you're far more likely to end up in poverty than other groups of Canadians. And also one of the statistics I put in there is that women living alone, there are about 29% of them who lived under the poverty threshold, which compares to roughly 10–12% on the average for the entire population. So what's really interesting to note with this is that there are important gaps in the Canadian pension system that contributes to these differentiated results, and we talk about these in the book more at length. And also wanted to talk about some of the key elements or think about future outlook. And what I decided to include, this is not a quote from the book actually, but it was done and linked with long-term care, long-term care experts in the civil service, pretty much had a very blunt assessment that most seniors tend to be quite poor. But from a critical point of view, we need private sector to increase our capacity. And this is exactly some of the type of issues we're seeing with long-term care in Canada, because seniors do not have the ability to actually finance that out of their own pocket, which is another illustration to show that there's really not that kind of affluence that would allow you to actually have dispensatory money to actually afford such services. As in fact, only 3% of Canadians have long-term care insurance. So it's another important indicator. Another element that it's quite worth pointing out is that a lot of the maturation of our pension system now include programs that tend to favor private savings. And what we are seeing more and more is that we're seeing an erosion of our poverty alleviation performances. So in the 1990s, actually, the instance, RRQ, which is the Quebec Pension Plan, or now it's called Retraite Québec, the Quebec Pension Agency, had a publication where we clearly boosted that we were among the best in the world, even better than Scandinavian countries at alleviating poverty. And poverty is usually measured by the number of individuals that receive 50%, that have an income that is below 50% of the median income. So we only had about 2%, which was phenomenal. However, what we've seen over time, because the old age security and the guaranteed income supplements are indexed on prices and not on wage, we're seeing an erosion of this performance little by little because we're not adjusting to the same kind of income level increase as people in the labor market, to the point that we're now in the middle of the pack if we look at the other industrialized country. So all of this to point out and in closing, to show that yes, we're doing a lot better than we used to do in the 1950s, 60s, and even in 70s, but it will be quite the stretch to actually conclude that seniors are wealthy in general. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was wonderful. Our next speakers are Kim Sawchuk and Constance Lafontaine, who will be presenting their chapter, That's Surprising at Your Age, The Myth of Digital Disinterest. Constance Lafontaine is the Associate Director of Aging and Communication and Technologies at Concordia University, where she mainly works on questions related to digital exclusions and digital practices. In 2020, she received Concordia's Engaged Scholar Award for her research work with Montreal community organizations. She's completing a PhD in communication studies at Concordia University, where she focuses on the intersections between discourses of global warming and contemporary animal spectacles. Dr. Kim Sawchuk is principal investigator of the ACT team, a professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Concordia University, and Concordia University Research Chair in Mobile Media Studies. She has written on aging and community-based research practices, age-friendly city policies, how older adults engage with digital media, algorithms and representations of age, and on aging and activism. Her most recent projects in this area explore the connections between crisis communications, social isolation, and digital disconnection. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Tristana. Kim, you're muted.
I'm unmuted now. Thank you, everyone. And it's a pleasure to know that there's people out there in Zoom land. So we're going to talk about the myth of digital disinterest and digital ageism today. And my name is Kim Sawchuk, and that's my colleague, Constance.
I'm Constance, and I also want to acknowledge our co-author, Lynn Grenier at the Université de Montréal.
Oops. Sadly, she couldn't make it today.
So the myth that we're talking about is this assumption that older adults are disinterested in digital technologies, are unable to learn digital technologies. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this myth in one form or another. It's one that pervades our birthday cards, sitcoms, memes on the internet. So this kind of idea that older adults are just not able to get digital technologies. And we argue in our chapter that there are three assumptions that underlie this myth. So the first, that there's this natural link between youth and what's new and innovation and technological adoption. Second, that older adults cannot and do not want to learn digital technologies. And when we think about the impacts of myths like this in the literature, they touch on a number of issues. So for instance, Martine Lagacé has argued that this impacts one's self-perceived ability to learn new digital technologies, or the way one will get treated in the workplace. The work of Alex Payne and Louis Nevin also showed that this can have an impact on the kinds of technologies that are designed for older adults. Also, the other assumption, which Patrick touched upon, is this idea that older adults are a homogeneous group. And so, of course, there's a wide range of diversity among older adults. One of the many ways that this connects to digital technologies is what Tim and also Barbara Crow have called the gray zone. So this idea that after 65, in a lot of statistical research, everyone's kind of the same. When it comes to technological practices, our own work and the work of others really shows that there are changes depending on on who you speak to. So people who will be 65 years old and people who will be 85 tend to have quite different relations to digital technologies. But of course, within this, and this is a point that we're emphasizing today, is that there are diverse digital practices among all older adults, including non-use. But this is related to a host of factors and certainly is not just a question of age.
So to challenge the myth of digital disinterest, we assert in our chapter that it's important to understand the complex intersectional realities of enduring digital divides and why they occur. And this will relate back to Patrick's talk. For instance, a recent report on Quebec seniors shows that older adults who make less than $20,000 annually are much less likely than the average person to use the internet. And indeed, there's a 31% discrepancy between these figures. So for example, the overall average is that 74% of older adults are connected to the internet. And that as well, that amongst people who make less than 20K, only 43% of older adults who earn this amount are likely to be connected to the internet because of cost. One of the things, again, the statistics don't tend to indicate is they don't make also a differentiation between someone who's 65 and someone who's much older. And as Patrick's statistics indicate, that's also really important, as is the question of gender and also immigration status related to work histories. Secondly, we say that we think it's important that people realize that access is contingent on a host of interrelated localized factors, but that these localized factors also operate against a backdrop of broader systemic issues and other kinds of variables. So for example, our work in low-income housing in Montreal, where we've conducted workshops for a number of years, really kind of asserts that it's important to have had a warm expert by your side, that it's important to understand the place where access is occurring or not occurring, and that it's important to set meaningful goals with the people that you're trying to give a kind of a digital experience to or introduce new technologies or applications to, and that these have an important role in learning new technologies. So again, one of the key questions that comes up for us now is how do we can't mimic this kind of proxemic relationship, the warm expert, but how do we, again, still provide some kind of environment where people who've never had access to Zoom but might find themselves suddenly being forced to become connected if they never have been before for certain kinds of reasons. How do we provide the kind of care that's needed to be able to give them kind of the experience of learning? As well, that we also know that what's important sometimes to older adults is thinking about new technologies just don't take care of themselves. That one has to care for them. So what happens when these technologies are not are introduced not only into a personal environment, but increasingly into care homes, into hospital settings? Who is taking care of those devices? Who's updating them? And who's also providing the person who they want to give access to with that access? So again, this is whole new areas of research are opening up because of the COVID situation. Thirdly, we question the dyad between user and non-user, and this draws from previous work that I did with Maria Fernandez-Alderall, Lynn Grenier, with people who were basically, I think the average age of our interlocutors for this study were octogenarians. The average age was, I think, people were 82, a very understudied group of digital users in our culture and non-users. And one of the interesting things is we realized that a lot of people made decisions about what types of technology they wanted to introduce into their lives and the circumstances that might also lead them to abandon them, and that it was deeply important for us to take that into account. And that non-use and didn't also mean that they weren't not interested. And we, in our culture, tend to make a kind of equation between ownership of a device and interest, or non-ownership and disinterest. And what one has to understand as well is that even if you don't own a device, that as the environment and the media environment changes around you, that can have an impact on the kind of connections that older adults make with family, with caregivers, and with friends.
So picking up on this idea of systemic obstacles to connections, and also tying links to some of the research that we've done recently. So we've done interviews with 52 older Canadians, and over half reported that the cost of services and devices hindered their use of digital technologies. So this typically happened in one of two ways. So on one hand, we spoke to people who said that owning a telephone, owning data, owning the access to the internet meant that they made great personal sacrifices. Some people reported reducing their grocery bills, going without food. A man told us that upon entering retirement, he decided to get a roommate, and this allowed him to have access to a cell phone with data. And then on the other side of this kind of sacrifice equation is that people believe that they just do not have access to the internet. It's too expensive, and that it belongs to a world other than theirs. And so this is for the older adults who cannot afford to access the internet. A lot of these discourses came up. Other people cite a fear of making a costly mistake. And of course, this is in the Canadian context where we pay a lot for our telecommunication. And so many of you might have had this experience of you forget that a certain app is running, or that you have a video running on your phone. And then at the end of the month, if you've gone over your allowed data for the month, you get a very large bill. A bunch of these mistakes that can be very costly mistakes in the Canadian context. So when we were speaking to older adults, a lot of them really curbed their uses of their digital technologies because they were afraid of just doing something wrong and ending up with a very large bill at the end of the month. And then we also found various ways in which technologies intersected with temporalities of older adults. Some people don't want to spend the time learning digital technologies. Other people recognize that it's not only extensive to learn the digital technology, but they don't necessarily want to spend the time to use it. And then they're also connected to what I just discussed in terms of the costly mistake. Some people have this experience of calling the telecommunication service provider, staying on the phone for hours in order to fix a mistake that they might have made, or to ask for them to give an exception and to remove this the overage charges. So this kind of quote of you either need a lot of money or you need a lot of time to be able to use these technologies. These ideas came up. Also, we've been conducting an international longitudinal survey. So we've completed the 3 waves, but we have the data for the 2016 and 2018 waves among 8 different countries, so 7 in Europe and Canada, and including roughly 10,000 participants, older adults. So in looking at this data, and Catherine Middleton and Mireia Fernandez-Ardeval are writing more about this, but noticing that Canadian seniors, they use fewer apps and fewer features on their phones. And so here, the indication potentially being that this is connected to differential pricing structure between Europe and Canada.
So again, in the Canadian context, we have an underregulated industry where misleading and aggressive sales practices, which were in the media some time ago, just as we've argued, disproportionately impact seniors. We know that Canada has some of the highest telecommunication costs in the industrialized world, where on the monthly average, people spend $257 Canadian per month for media access. Most seniors spend about $187, but that's a phenomenal amount of money if you're earning $20,000 a year. We know that, again, there's a new digital charter that came out last year that states that Canadians will have equal opportunity to participate in the digital world and be given the necessary tools to do so, including access, connectivity, literacy, and skills. Yet, there's no real strategy for how we are going to achieve this. We also know that corporations are devising increasingly sophisticated, expensive, and data-heavy devices, such as smartwatches and smartphones that also use more data, and we're being encouraged to use more data. And also we're seeing telehealth coming online, which also raises questions for us about the necessity for older adults to have digital access and for Canadians to have data plans that also will facilitate them being able to have not just access to knowing what time it is or whether they can access weather on their watch, but really maybe they're being asked by doctors to monitor their heart rates, for example. So these things are increasingly transforming as the world around us are changing, which impacts seniors in a very, I think, important way that's age related, but is not about the innate properties of what it means to be older.
And so connected to all this is also remembering that for those older adults who had the income, who had the work experience, who had a white collar job and were able to learn digital technologies years ago, they were able to accrue knowledge over time. Where it's a much steeper hill for those who are just starting to learn digital technologies at the age of 75, for instance. And so we're seeing also a shift from a choice to a digital imperative. So we saw a little while ago while we were working on a report to the CRTC, telecommunication companies compare their services to a luxury. So they compare it to literally having a fancy cup of coffee. However, I think a lot of us know that the reality is that a lot of our lives are more and more contingent on having a connection. So we see this kind of dual relationship between, on one hand, forced digitization. So the kind of a situation where you have to more and more connect to digital technologies and acquire digital services and devices. And on the other hand, digital exclusion. So we're seeing services from banking to government services that are increasingly primarily online. There are some countries that mandate everyone to have an email address and to do their dealings with the government online only, and you can get a fine for not doing this. And so the result is either you're pushed into this digital world or you're necessarily excluded from vital services. COVID-19 really precipitated forced digitization for many people, but also puts into focus the perils of digital divides. So one of the current projects that we're working on at ACT has been it's called Grocery Response NDG, where we've put together a grocery ordering and delivery service with community organizations in NDG for older adults who are not connected to the internet. And one of the things that we're researching with Nicole Fornelli and Andrea Tremblay is these kinds of connections that exist between digital disconnection and also food insecurity, especially in moments of crises like this one. Then we see an acceleration of digitization and a data boom. Kim touched on this as well, the kind of precipitation of telehealth, online services, teleconference, and also digital technologies as a means of circumventing social isolation that older adults might feel in moments like this. So touching on the other program, Seniors Can Connect, new programs like this one are just popping up, and they aim to bridge a digital divide to overcome disparities that are caused by digital technology. So in a sense, a lot of community organizations now are getting funding to deploy tablets into the community. And so our role in this process is to try to better understand how this works, if such practices are feasible, and also to kind of evaluate the sustainability and effectiveness of such programs.
Yeah, and once again, to also understand the impact it can also have on already overstretched community workers, especially in moments of crisis. So just to conclude, age is a factor, of course, but we need to avoid these deterministic notions that make age the cause of digital disinterest. When it comes to older adults, choices and personal conditions related to age practices and experience, often we see still get reduced to a question of age, and we can find ourselves making these kind of comments, about, you know, I just don't get it because I wasn't born in this period, not understanding that it's a whole confluence of factors that are related to motivation, haptics, devices and their affordances, but also systemic issues that need to be analyzed. And that there's a need to mobilize what we call complementary research approaches to understand the impacts of forced digitization, digital exclusion, and to develop meaningful strategies for inclusion, and to continue the study with community organizations on the kind of like introduction of these new technologies into these environments. And for this, we're eternally grateful for the collaborations we have with not just individuals, but with a whole variety of organizations here in Montreal, but also more and more in Canada. And we need to think about the demands of these technologies on practices of care. We need to have longer term studies of digital literacy programs and their efficacy for older adults. And we also, I think, need to challenge corporate discourses about the place of telecommunications in society and devise plans for accessibility with our government and think about regulation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both. That was wonderful. Our next speaker is Daniel Dixon. The title of his contribution is Aging with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, The Myth of the Eternal Child. Daniel Dixon is a PhD student in political science at Concordia University. His research focuses on social policy with specific attention to the politics of aging and disability. Prior to his graduate studies, Daniel worked for 5 years as a personal support worker for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in his hometown of Toronto. He's currently hard at work on his dissertation project, creating a cross-country provincial policy index to compare social inclusion policies for older adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities across Canada. During the pandemic, he has been happy to share a home office with his 18-month-old daughter, whose interest in books is quickly dwarfing his own. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Tristana. Yeah, so thank you to the other presenters too. Those are wonderful chapters, which I really enjoyed in the book. The myth that I look at is not one that relates only to older adults or to aging people, but to people with intellectual disabilities more broadly. And so the purpose of my chapter is to see how this myth ages and how it applies specifically to older adults with intellectual disabilities. And the myth is that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are eternal children. This idea, based on a reductive stereotype, that people with intellectual disabilities are frozen in a state of childhood and they never develop past this state. And so obviously the myth is clearly false and based on a misunderstanding and a willful ignorance of the diversity of experience of different people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But the question that I kind of wanted to explore beyond the chapter is, how does this affect their experience of older adulthood? Does it act to deny authentic experiences of older adulthood? And you know, this idea of being a child, does it follow them around throughout their lives? And why does this idea persist? And so I guess the origin of the myth is in the basis of disability stigma, which is this idea that disability is a personal tragedy, something that happens to somebody. This is a way of finding disability within an individual. It puts the responsibility for disability on an individual. It limits the understanding of disability to only an impairment, only a diagnosis. So it pathologizes what disability is. And the impact of this is it puts the onus on the disabled person to bring themselves into society rather than on a society to be inclusive and accommodating to disabled people. And so really what the chapter is about, and what I think a lot of disability advocacy is about, is gaining social inclusion, finding ways to kind of reverse a history of social exclusion. And so in the chapter, I talk about institutionalization, which is this really dark history that Canada has in its relationship with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. If you're not familiar with institutions, this era has only recently ended, but people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were warehoused away in these rural locations and subjected to really terrible conditions, all sorts of abuse, over-medication, forced sterilization. And in Quebec, this era only recently ended. but there's still social exclusion. It's just in different ways now. Now it's through lack of access to social functions. There's much lower rates of employment and education among the population of people with intellectual disabilities. And so the impact of this is it leads to fewer opportunities for this group to represent themselves and to be seen as non-children or living authentic versions of adulthood. And so, there's also an extra onus because a lot of the older adults, the current cohort of older adults with intellectual disabilities, are survivors of this previous era of institutionalization. And so they're living with the trauma that's been inherited from a lifetime of kind of neglect and abuse within the health and social services structures. And so bringing that legacy forward, there's an impetus on the government and on a society more broadly to accommodate and try to find remedy for this group. And so, the implications of the myth are important. As a policy scholar, ideas such as these, misunderstandings, myths, stereotypes are really important because they are at the heart of how policies behave. If you understand the ideas that are behind policies, then you understand how the policies act. And so what this myth does is it legitimates the idea of disability as dependence. It creates basically a one-to-one relationship where disability is dependence. And that's really problematic in a society where independence is a value that is so valorized, because it basically stacks the deck against people with intellectual disabilities who, seen this way, are seen as kind of frozen in a state of dependence. It's also more specifically been used as a rationale to deny access to health and social services to this specific cohort, who I must stress are at the far margins of society here in Quebec. And so in the chapter, I talk about how under a regime of austerity, social spending for older adults with intellectual disabilities was rolled back, and how access to day programs was taken away and given to younger adults who were also facing kind of bottlenecks in the system. There's also been a lot of new information since the COVID-19 pandemic about how older adults with intellectual disabilities have been disproportionately victimized and faced really adverse conditions in the pandemic. One of the most prominent examples was the first draft of the triage protocol that the Ministry of Health and Social Services introduced when in the early stages of the pandemic. There was discussions about who would receive critical care, who would have access to ventilators and beds, and there was a really ableist triage protocol that was put out by the Quebec government that received a lot of attention and a lot of really immediate clapback from disability advocates. And then I guess the last negative implication of the myth is it can be used to downplay this urgency that I was talking about. So, I feel that there's this imminence, this urgency to find remedies and reparations for the survivors of institutions who, again, are in older adulthood, and many of whom are beginning to pass away without this acknowledgement that they suffered at the hands of the Canadian government. So how do we bust the myth? Well, broadly, what's required is the greater social inclusion of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But that is a really complicated concept, really multidimensional concept. And it's hard to just kind of snap your fingers and make inclusion happen. So what I think is the most effective avenue is increasing opportunities for voice. So this means disability advocacy efforts and policy processes must introduce and accommodate the involvement of people with intellectual disabilities, and specifically older adults with intellectual disabilities, as a key constituency. So if you look at the nature of disability advocacy in Canada, it's very much oriented towards younger adults. Right now, a lot of the real gains in advocacy are happening for the cohort who are advancing out of, from turning 18. So going from one service system and education services system to another, which would be employment, vocational programming. And certainly there's tremendous bottlenecks there. There's a lot of problems, and that's a great area for focus. But what's happening is the gains that are occurring for that cohort are coming at the expense of older adults with intellectual disabilities who are losing access to vital programs because governments are not willing to increase spending significantly to accommodate these changes. And so what's needed is a broader coalition of voices in the advocacy and policy design process. There are reasons for optimism. Person-centered care, which is a method of social services provision, which privileges the voices of people with intellectual disabilities who are using the services, is an increasingly popular model of care. And so that's happening across the country. There's a growing commitment towards person-centered care. And then I also bring up the increasing popularity of participatory research methods, which is a methodological technique that gives voice to, in this case, it would be to older adults with intellectual disabilities who can be involved in shaping knowledge accumulation and knowledge dissemination in ways that we can learn from. Instead of talking about people, we can give people the opportunity to speak for themselves. Lastly, COVID-19, as I mentioned, has brought both some opportunities and a lot of new obstacles. So early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of optimism about how, now people will be able to understand what social isolation feels like, or now people will be more sensitive to the dire situations that are happening, for instance, in like long-term care facilities or group homes where people are kind of put into these risky situations and with the social distancing measures, et cetera, they're not getting the same kind of interaction that they would prior. But a new set of obstacles has also arisen. I mentioned the triage policy. It's important to acknowledge that older people with intellectual disabilities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic in terms of adverse health outcomes. And so while it would be nice to think that this kind of catastrophe would reorient ourselves and create a more caring culture, I'm hopeful that happens, but it seems like there's a new set of obstacles that will come along as well. So the opportunities to challenge this myth and to create policies that are more inclusive of the voices of older adults with intellectual disabilities is there, but it's going to require a lot of social buy-in.
Thank you, Danielle. That was great. So we will open the floor now to panel discussion and questions from the audience. I'll just remind you that you can pose your questions in the question and answer box just in the bottom of your screen. I'll wait for some of these questions to come in, and I wanted to, if I could just start, I wanted to pick up on, Danielle, your last point in your presentation. The book came out in the middle of the pandemic, or depending how you see the pandemic, during the pandemic, and it was written, many of the articles were written prior to the pandemic. I'm wondering now, in light of what the pandemic has revealed, if you could say a little bit about, or if you could sort of cast the lens, the COVID lens on your articles and on the question of ageism and sort of, and what opportunities and sort of what obstacles have been newly presented, if any, in light of the sort of kind of catastrophic and unique circumstances we find ourselves today. And so we can start with you, Daniel, if you'd like to sort of pick up on that last point.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as I say, there's reasons for pessimism. There's reasons for optimism. There's been some commitments to social spending that have been I've been surprised by. One of the things that's new and kind of picks up on what Patrick was talking about is there's a new disability benefit that's being brought forward that would have important implications for older adults with intellectual disabilities. It's actually based on the GIS, so it's a similar model. I think it's also indexed to wages, but whatever, we'll take what we can get. But aside from that, there's going to be tremendous challenges. one of the things that the policymakers are going to be thinking about is rebuilding the economy. And you know, when rebuilding, yes, there's opportunities for new ideas to be brought forward, but really, I think that the impetus is going to be on feeding people who have lost everything. You know, I'm a little bit pessimistic that this is the opportunity for a brand new care-based economy where everyone's voice is heard. I would love that to be the case, but I don't know. So there's a lot remains to be seen, but you know, this is a group that's been really adversely affected in these times, and so really it's about kind of gaining back some of the ground that was blazed before the pandemic, and then seeing where we can go from there.
Yeah, thank you. Do some of the other panelists want to pick up on the opportunities or the sort of more pessimistic obstacles?
Sure, I can start perhaps with regards to our work on digital technologies. On one hand, I think there's a recognition of what digital disconnection entails for older adults, what it can mean in terms of, as I mentioned, the connection to food insecurity as just one of the many elements. So I guess recognition is, and the funding that has come up, the opportunities that have come up for getting older adults connected to tablets or other technologies might be something that's positive. I think a more kind of cynical view is also thinking of how this connects to corporate incentives, to, for instance, what happens to the data that gets connected with older adults using these technologies. Are these programs sustainable at all? What does it mean in terms of caregiving and caregivers? How are they going to be in a position where they need to also care for the technologies, and how that gets another burden added to their work? And there's also a sense of, Kim mentioned it, a lot of these programs are framed very much in a kind of charitable discourse of, oh, this company and this company doing something great during COVID and providing older adults with digital technologies without addressing some of the underlying long-standing policy issues that continue to sustain a digital divide in society.
When it comes to pension, there hasn't been much done, really, except the temporary, a one-time check for OAS and one-time check for GIS. I think it was $200 each, if my memory is not failing. But I think what we see more on the financial side is the fact that there's been a strong resurgence on the number of scams going on during the pandemic. And there's a lot of community groups quite well aware and been on the ground to remind older adults to be very mindful of that situation. And there's also I think the biggest impact on the retirement side might have been how it will change the planning of certain individuals on retirement, right, or about to retire. We may even have to see a number of individuals going back to the labor market as a result of the pandemic, but it will take years before we can fully assess, right, that situation and the impact on the pandemic.
A point you made about the sort of increased vulnerability of older people to scams, it ties in nicely with a question we have from in the question and answer box. The question was originally posed during Kim and Constance's talk, but I think it fits nicely here. Has there been any research done with seniors on their fears of using online banking, fears of being hacked, scams, and that sort of thing? Maybe we could start maybe with Kim. Or
yes, there is indeed. One of the members of our network, Galit Nimrod from Israel, has done a whole study on what she calls techno stress, and also the kind of technophobias. And so she's looked at it from a kind of more social psychology perspective to understand those kind of fears. What we call fears, though, or hesitancies, are sometimes kind of also because there's different conceptions about privacy as well that can be generationally tied. So So I'm not sure if this gets to an answer to the question, but you know, sometimes older adults get talked about as hesitant users. Well, sometimes it's because they've asked kind of critical questions before about whether they can afford or whether they really need a device in their life. So kind of fear has to be kind of pulled apart. It's a really interesting question. There's also kind of fears, I guess, that are kind of legitimate, related back to what Patrick said about kind of being uncertain about the kind of encryptions and about the kind of what they might be opening themselves up to in terms of what researchers like Joanna Redden and the group who does work on data justice would call data harms, and the implications of what it means to make parts of your make your life and your data habits accessible online and what that may open you up to. So what we might call fears are also because I think as a society, there's a lot of uncertainty about what all of this actually means and a lot of black boxing around what we call black boxing in the literature. We can't crack this technology open. It's hard to understand. And so understanding how, you know, when those fears are actually kind of legitimate concerns and questions and or obstacles that actually make it impossible for someone to think that I can learn. So again, the fear questions, the fear factor is a really interesting research question, and there is work on that. And if people are interested in any particular articles, just send us a note and we're happy to point you to sources and resources on these issues.
Maybe just to add to this as well, in terms of the technophobia, one of the findings was also that there was a connection between one's proficiency using digital technologies and the level of phobia, of stress that somebody might encounter in using a new technology. And I know there's been a lot of research done on scams and older adults, specifically, like that niche of literature, but very actually quite conflicting findings throughout all this. But one of the elements that comes up often is the connection to digital literacy and the ability to tell what the subtle cues of scams or fraud might be. I mean, it's difficult. I mean, the scams are becoming so much more sophisticated day by day, deep fakes, for instance. And how do we build these subtle ability to differentiate what is real, what is fake, and how is this tied to digital knowledge? So I think that is an open question, right, to consider. And flip side of that as well to consider, it's not, the onus is not just on the user or the older adult. What we saw in some of the work on misleading and aggressive practices by telecommunication in Canada, not to kind of say it's a scam necessarily, I don't want to be that, you know, yeah, I don't want to say necessarily it's a scam, but in terms of some of the practices are reminiscent of some scam practices, people target older adults as well for perceived vulnerability they might have in a specific subject matter. And here in the telecommunication sphere, a perceived vulnerability they might have in terms of technology. So taking advantage of that essentially for profit.
Thank you so much, Constance. Daniel, did you want to add anything to this point that you raised at the end of your presentation?
No, I mean, just about COVID or about potentials for abuse again?
One of the things that seems to be what I'm hearing in all of the presentations is that when I think at least at the beginning in the first wave in Canada, we saw that there was a focus on the medical vulnerability of older adults, and what I see bindings what each of the presentations have shared in common is that the ways in which older adults were made vulnerable was not just in terms of their medical vulnerabilities, but it had, made them vulnerable in other ways as well. So that was sort of
so on that, there's I've got a lot to say on that. Unfortunately, and I should preface this by saying that, like, a lot of my experience with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is based on my history as a support worker, and that's really just a very small segment of the population that are receiving supports in a residential setting, for example. But from talking to people in the field, there's been a lot of turnover in terms terms of staff. And so like, you know, support staff for people living in group homes, for example, are, they have the same staff every day, right? They'll have like a primary staff, and that person works with them from, you know, 40 hours a week. That's a really close bond. And because of COVID, there's been a lot of staff turnover. There's been people who've become infected and had to leave. There's been people who've feared infection and quit. There's been people who've been overworked. There's been people who've been moved around. And that's causing a lot of disruption in sort of the like relational aspects of people's lives. They're losing contact to their best friend. And also, you know, there's an intimacy that goes along with that work as well, that when you have somebody just come in like as a temporary worker who's just coming, you know, in from down the street or whatever, they don't have that same kind of knowledge, experiential knowledge of working with someone. I know that that's still kind of within a sort of professionalized lens, but I think it warrants mentioning because that's a social aspect of harm that's happened in the pandemic that's been really difficult for a lot of people. And also just increased isolation. So this is a population that has already become kind of accustomed to isolation through systems beyond their control for a very long time, and it's become a lot worse in this period. So yeah, there's just been it's so multifaceted. There's so many aspects of harm that are occurring that we'll learn more about, I guess, as things change, as things open up. But yeah, there's a lot to discuss there.
One of the ways in which sort of shifting the register a little bit away from COVID just for a moment, but one of the ways in which the sort of systemic obstacles of connection, just to use Kim and Constance's language, to correct those or to eliminate them completely, has been this idea of an age-friendly approach to systemic oppression and ageism and so on. I'm wondering if each of you might speak to this concept, how it might, what you think of this approach. Will it do as it promised? Has it done what it's promised? We can start perhaps with Patrick.
Yeah, we actually have a book chapter on age-friendly city, and we're actually quite critical, not on the, well, the approach has some limitation, but I think the primary issue has nothing to do with the approach, but it has to do with the type of resources and the policy settings that we live in. In Canada, municipalities tend to have very limited powers and intervention when it comes to aging. For instance, in most European cities, home care services are provided by municipalities, not by regional health authority, which is the case in Canada. So if you look at the budget and the type of resources that city possesses and what we expect them to do, there's a huge gap. And I think unless we start finding a funding formula or a new mechanism to actually give municipalities the tool to actually act more meaningfully in social care and in anything that relates to aging, I think that would be, I think, the first step. And we also have to keep in mind that Canada is, if you look at the number, I think the percentage of older adult age 65 and above receiving social care or care broadly defined is about 4.5%, which is very much in the low end. So most industrialized countries, we're talking about usually 10 to 12% of seniors research services. So there's a major gap. And that also speaks volumes with not only our limited amount of funding, but where we spend that funding. So we tend to spend our funding mostly on long-term care homes. So despite all the scandals we have today and people saying what's going on, well, in fact, we still spend about 80 to 82% of our spending on long-term care on the CHSLD and less than 20% on home care, even though we've had home care as a priority for the past 30 years. So all of this, and that's part of the reasons in the chapter we explore this in more depth, but we're quite skeptical in this new narrative that the cities will come in and take more of a role and be much more engaged as political and policy actors.
Thank you, Patrick. Kim, Constance?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one of the petals on the age-friendly city flower that you see if you look at the World Health Organization documents is communications and technologies as part of the age-friendly city agenda. But when we look at how cities are also thinking about doing outreach to older adults, the assumption is that people already have that access. So when we've even looked at sort of how age-friendly city policies are being rolled out and how participation is being structured quite often, it's often through online means. And that, again, when you then look at sort of those questions of systemic exclusion, if you start to realize that people over the age of 75 are only 43% of them in Quebec actually probably have a report having regular access to the internet, then you're developing policies and participatory forms that are predicated already on a level of access that just doesn't exist. And so you're leaving people out of a you can leave people out of important discussions. So understanding these entanglements between the kind of myth of digital access as being universal in a sense, and being affordable and available to everybody here, and how that impacts and intersects with age, but also with the implementation of the age-friendly agenda, I think is, again, something we're deeply interested in. But also, as Patrick said, it's really difficult to think about how municipalities could actually implement this kind of agenda given the kind of situations they find themselves in. But as well, we also find myths where a city like Montreal is increasingly marketing itself, if you look at some of its online work, as a city for youth. And so we've looked at, say, Tourism Montreal and the way they represent age, and they promise Montreal to be a city where you never grow up, which is a kind of repudiation of aging itself as something that can be, you know, not only just something that we're all going to experience, we're all going to get old, but also something that also, you know, is an important and vital part of our urban environment, that old people aren't just a burden on systems, that they contribute to the civic life of cities. And what we actually see in the pandemic as well around this is how many older adults have been volunteers in civic and community organizations in our cities. And then when they become the population that's told you have to stay home, these kind of volunteer banks of volunteers kind of dry up. And it's just, again, a reminder of the kind of contribution that older adults actually play to the life of the city. And so I would like the city to be as friendly to those of us who are aging, and that's everybody, as they can be. It's in all of our interests.
Or just, yeah, I think you both did a great job of answering this. I would just add like two elements. Is also a lot of, it seems from Kim and Mike's work on this, a lot of the responsibilities for consulting seems to be downloaded to community groups that are so overwhelmed and very busy following their own mission. And so there's a kind of expectation they do a lot of the legwork, not only in service delivery and in many ways in the city, but also the work of representing the ideas of their constituents. And then also I think it's worth thinking of how much of this is just kind of like multiplying buzzwords between smart cities and sustainable cities and age-friendly cities. And when you're looking at these plans, there are very few connections between all of them. So there's no thinking of you know, digital connection or digital strategies in the age-friendly city. And that tells you a lot about the city's conception of older adults. And there's nothing about aging in the smart city plan that Montreal put together, which tells you a lot about how they think about technology and smart. So yeah. So let fewer silos, and also actually thinking about how these plans work together to building the future of the city.
Thank you, Constance. Daniel, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I think, you know, I absolutely agree with what Constance was saying. You know, I think one of the ways to eliminate the sort of siloization that's happening is as I was saying, to kind of give opportunities for voice. There's definitely ways within municipal politics. I think what's great about municipal politics is that there are opportunities to be a little bit more accessible. There are opportunities for more delegative and there's opportunities for more participatory forms of governance. But specifically for people with intellectual disabilities, older people with intellectual disabilities, I think what cities need to be doing now is playing defense more than playing offense. So, you know, protecting the public spaces that are really high high value to that group. Protecting the de facto public spaces like malls that can be really important places for congregating and for socializing, because this particular group of people is very not affluent. There's no myth of the affluent older adults with intellectual disabilities. And so often there's a lot of making do and trying to use what's available as best as possible to find some semblance of community and inclusion. And so cities need to be on board with that and really listen to see where those really valuable public spaces are.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on a great comment in the question and answer box. The comment is, let's hope that the users, older people, can have some input. And I think that comment really brings together some of the points that were explicit in your presentations, but I would love to hear more about sort of the how can older people, or how do we ensure that the participation of older people in the policies and in the worlds that affect them are meaningful and substantial. And I really like this complementary research approach that Kim, you brought up in your presentation. So maybe we'll start with you first. If you could just speak to this idea of meaningful input, meaningful and substantial input.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our work is to think about how we can, as academics, involve individuals and organizations who already have deep knowledge of this constituent and of the great variety of older adults who live in our cities or in our rural areas as well. I mean, we're in Montreal, but that's a whole other question around the digital divide. So again, it's developing research agendas that are, because there's a kind of a deep engagement and building experience and trust with community organizations and working with older adults, and being willing to transform your research agenda and questions to kind of meet the kind of queries of that community. So again, a lot of our work is about creating those connections and liaisons over time, so that when an issue like the COVID situation comes up, we've got some experience, we've got some knowledge as well. And it's really the knowledge of those people, the people who are out there on the ground, and working closely with them. Understanding that, you know, again, participatory action research methods are important because you want to make social change, but that's a long-term proposition. Be patient. Doing this work is, I always like to say, it's like doing the dishes. It's never over and you're always going to be doing them. And then also that, you know, we like to do work that's theoretical, work that's drawing on data and statistics that exist, but also asking what statistical questions and what questions aren't being asked that data needs to be gathered. And how can we get better empirical evidence to kind of reflect more the kind of experiences of what it means to be aging in this particular moment in time. So we really think a lot about how what data, large-scale data collection like the longitudinal study will do and can do for us, and understanding that language and its power when you're also making say a policy report or statement, but also the power of testimonial and the power of individual older adults' words, and having used them in different reports. That's what people remember, is this the older person telling us that, you know, if I you know, have to buy this data plan, then I can't buy groceries that week. Or realizing if we've given you know, money to people to participate in a study, for some older adults, they can give that to charity as a tax write-off, the $20 that we may give them to participate in something, and for someone else that's their groceries for a week. And so realizing that there's a kind of politics and power to all this research, and how you have to create the conditions for inclusions. And sometimes when governments put out surveys and only put them online, we printed them out and we go to the malls, you go to where the people are and you talk to them and you fill out the survey. And even if they say, well, you're gonna muck up our data set by using this and you have to fill it out online, we'll insist that we bring the data that we collect to governments and organizations because it's important. And then it's important to, again, as researchers, to work for us to work in collaboration with community groups and organizations to develop research that meets their needs, but also can help them create the arguments and have a better understanding of both the value of what they do and what they contribute, but think about other ways that it can always be improved. So, you know, it's a wide open field that's amazing and wonderful to work in for all kinds of reasons. Constance, do you want to add anything about complementary methods? We like data of all kinds, and we like theory, and we like speculation.
I'd say part of this is also, at ACT at least, it's also been building long-term connections to partners in various ways and building the trust over time. I see in the participant list, we've got like some of the people that we've been working closely with for the last 7 or plus years. And it's really been about kind of thinking together and working on projects that usually have a clear kind of outcome, but being open to the research possibilities and the collaborative possibilities that emerge through that. So the one thing that we've talked a number of times about today was the misleading and aggressive practices. That was born from digital literacy workshops we were doing that had absolutely nothing to do with this. And the work of RECA, Respecting Elders Communities Against Abuse, helped us reframe some of this in terms of older adult mistreatment and financial mistreatment. So all of these perspectives have been incredibly crucial to any kind of research that we've done, and also any kind of policy intervention that we've done to, in this case, federal governments. And not only has this perspective been crucial, but these interventions were done with community organizations. And I think on one hand, it makes the research truly emerge from the experiences of people who are often overlooked in government research and academic research, but also brings their own experiences to bear, you know, hopefully when systems work correctly on policies.
Thank you, Constance. Patrick or Danielle, would you like to say a little bit about participatory research methods in political science?
I'll let Danielle go first.
Sure. So they're not immensely popular in political science, but there's a growing, a slowly growing popularity of participatory methods. Certainly, for my research, it's necessary, right? I have to engage with people with intellectual disabilities because I'm not intellectually disabled. I can't speak about anything approximate to the experience of how services affect them without speaking to them. There's a really famous slogan for the disability rights movement, which is "Nothing about us without us," and that has to be kind of a rallying call for all disability research, and you know, that's that. But actually, and just as a side note, you know, speaking of infantilization, one of the things that's kind of interesting is when you're doing ethics review work to get the opportunity to interview people with intellectual disabilities, they're considered a vulnerable group, and there's a lot about informed consent and decision-making capacity that has to be kind of approached, and that can be really difficult for newer researchers. So that's kind of like an institutional obstacle that can be a bit of a barrier to participatory research, but one that can be overcome. But yeah, no, it's certainly a really valuable approach, especially when you're talking about marginalized groups, because the inherent problem is that they do not have a voice. They're looking for opportunities for voice to challenge these kind of myths that have really negative implications. You know, something that advocacy groups are saying more and more commonly now is that the system is not broken, right? The institutions of the system are working the way that they're supposed to. What needs to happen is that we need to challenge the ideas. So, you know, I had the opportunity to go to another province and interview people working at a residential institution for people with intellectual disabilities. And I was surprised in one sense because the people who were there took their job very seriously. They cared very deeply for the people that they were supporting. And you know, in their minds, the work that they were doing was positive. It's the model that's problematic, right? It's the model of institutional living that's problematic. And there's problems with the group home model. There's problems with all aspects of social services delivery to this population. And so we need to investigate those ideas. And in order to do that, and to challenge those ideas. And in order to do that, it does take a really multidisciplinary, multimedia, multi-dimensional approach. And so that's why things like even kind of more rigid disciplines like political science can engage with other disciplines, can engage with other mediums, can engage with arts-based research. There needs to be ways to challenge these kind of deeply embedded ideas that are at the core, and that takes attack from all fronts.
Well, I can maybe just add to this. It depends on the research question, right? So for a lot of the work in political science, we're interested in how policies and politics influence the type of decisions you pass in the legislature. So you tend to follow who are the actors behind it, right? In some cases, it could be initiatives for civil servants. So you want to understand what happened within the civil service that led them to think about specific issues that way. Or other times it can be a spur of the moment social movements that caused a lot of chaos and prompt politicians to act on an issue that long been forgotten. So for us, it's very, the extent to which it's participatory or who you engage with is really dependent on the elements we are studying.
Thank you, Patrick and Danielle. I'm going to just go to the question and answer box. There's a comment there. I must congratulate you all for addressing these challenges, as we must not forget that in 10 years, 50% of the population will be seniors. I think it's 25% by the year 2036. Plus, with the advances made medically, citizens are living longer. So pensions, housing, healthcare will be essential needs. One of the things I see in this question is, what is the value or what are the benefits of living in an aging society? So you've discussed some of the benefits of the sort of perspectives of including some of the perspectives of older people in the policies and the cultures and so on that affect them. And so now this question seems to be sort of at a higher level. What's the value of living in an aging society, or the benefits? That language might be quite precise, but maybe we'll start with, I don't know, Patrick, if you want to start with that question.
Yes, well, I usually tend to think of these questions as there are some challenges, but there are also benefits, right? So in many ways, I think some of the ongoing changes we're starting to see with an aging society across the Western world is redefinition of what retirement is. So we no longer assume that you're 65, it's over and done, and then bye-bye. So more and more we are individuals starting a second career. Other individuals decide, you know what, I'd like to work a day a week. I want to give more time to volunteers. So I don't think it's, I think it's a bit false to look at it in a dichotomous ways, right? So we're gonna have aging society, it's different. But in fact, if you look at these changes, it's very, very slow going. So like I remember a lot of the statistics that they show you, like this population of the society is gonna be that age. And then I'm doing the math with my own age. It's okay, I'm gonna be long gone by then. So a lot of this, there's so much trial and errors with long-term projections. So even in the short term, we have a hard time predicting what's going to be. So if we start thinking about what's going to happen in 30, 40, 50 years, there's so many things involved into this that it's very hard to think and conceive in what's going to be. But otherwise, in terms of advantage and older society, if you think about labor force issues, right, it tends to be if you have a more experienced workforce, it tends to be something that is highly valuable, right? That's not true across all sectors of employment, but for a large part, some of it is something that it's highly valuable. You also think and hope, like for example, if you think about social care, you hope that and COVID would be helping for that we're going to start to value certain services like social care that we have not before. So from a political science professor, you're hoping that eventually the number of people is going to tip the scale so that, you know, older individual will actually be able to get better services better care and will be better equipped to actually transition into a society where it's going to be much less ageist than it is now.
Thank you, Patrick. Kim, Constance.
I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. I think Patrick touched on some of the things that I was thinking about, the kind of greater recognition of the needs of older adults. Hopefully, I mean, we could see both happening, but I would hope a decrease in some of the ageist discourses and practices that we have in society that causes a lot of discrimination, and kind of greater visibility for older adults and respect for their rights. I think we're seeing some of this, and I think it's been precipitated through COVID in certain ways. These kinds of questions of visibilities of the conditions under which certain older adults are living, and kind of greater recognition of this and better policies to address them.
Kim or Daniel, would you like to say a few words?
Just I guess to echo what both Constance and Patrick said, I mentioned in the presentation, we're a society that really valorizes independence. There's an opportunity with changing demographics to kind of reorient ourselves a little bit that way, and find new kind of organizing principles that aren't so much focused on independence and performance, and can maybe instead be focused on care or relationality, or so those types of things are opportunities that could come with demographic shifts.
Great.
I don't know, just more on a general thing. If you're aging, it means you're living, and how that is, and hopefully that's a good thing. And how do we make those conditions so people can experience their aging, as Amanda Grenier says, a series of lifelong transitions where we're living at every moment and living together. So how do we address fear of aging, not just fear of technology? How do we implement intergenerational connection and contact so that it's not seen that older adults are not other, but that we also don't other youth as we age? How do we create a society where we value and value, not just value by saying, yes, nice people, pat on the head, not infantilizing value, but recognize older adults and our aging process, so we can live not just in dignity and with respect, but maybe live ungracefully and with chutzpah as we grow old, and continue to be agents of change, but interacting with everybody else. So I think that there's lots for us to continue to think about and do in these areas that are not only about saying other cliches, like when I get older, I don't necessarily get wiser, for sure. But there is a certain kind of, there's experience that comes along with that one has to continue to evaluate and reevaluate. And how do we create those opportunities for those continual reevaluations with all populations in our societies, and those also who are the old, to quote other age studies scholars, who again are often, invisibilized. So again, I think as academics, we do what we do, and it's up to us to figure out how we transform our research agendas to make them accountable to these issues and responsive to them.
I just want to add, I think one of the questions for me, it's difficult to think about this question, at least for me, without thinking about climate change and where the world as a whole is going, and how people will be aging into the future. And as we're thinking of changing these systems, of adapting these systems to demographic shifts, it's probably a good time to start thinking of how we adapt these systems in order to enable aging as other generations grow older as well.
Thank you. I just want to encourage everyone to ask any questions, to pose them in the question and answer box. I do have a question actually for the panelists that has come up throughout the discussions. I wanted to ask about the term aging itself and what value it has. It's at least it's been used ambiguously in a lot of in aging studies, and sometimes it's used to describe a qualitatively distinct period at the end of life. Sometimes it's used to describe a biological process, so looking at functional and structural changes at the level of the organism. Sometimes it's used to talk about the life course, and sort of just to Kim, you mentioned earlier that everybody is aging, that when we speak about aging, we are sort of alienated from ourselves, if you are a younger person, to not see yourself as part of this trajectory. So I wanted to ask this question of like, what of this term that we've been using to describe a particular phenomenon, is there a better term, or should we continue to just, as the panelists have, denaturalize it, denormalize it, depathologize it, and retain it? Sort of, it's a big question that I'll just sort of lob at each of the panelists. We can maybe start, well, whoever would like to start first. Kim, you'll have to unmute yourself, I think.
I mean, I would like to know from whoever's still left out there in Zoom land, how they understand their own aging and what aging means to you. When you think about age and aging, do you think about it as biology? As in biological, the discipline, it's senescence. It's about deterioration to a large extent of the organism. You know, there's a cultural perspective on aging, which talks about it in relationship to other kinds of systems. So I'm curious about, I theoretically draw on the work of Amanda Grenier, who's not looked at, at aging in terms of stages. I mean, there's life changes and transitions that happen at particular periods. And even if we think about biology, I often think about my own biology. I've often said I have my 80-year-old toe that was far older than the rest of me was. And sometimes when you're older, you're not, I'm still behave like a 12-year-old at some moments in my life. So the age that I am, I never leave behind the ages that I was. And I'm always thinking about the age that I will be. And some parts of me are much older than other parts of me. So even my own biological age, I think, is extraordinarily uneven. So aging is a kind of a complex process that I think it's up to us to kind of, we can untangle it in terms of how it's situated in just different scientific disciplines or research disciplines, but there's also that kind of aging as an experience. And Joy House, someone has written that this organism is deteriorating. And again, that's something also, I mean, we have attacked decline narratives, that we're supposed to embrace our aging and think it's always wonderful. It's not always easy, and it's not always wonderful. And there's days where it's extraordinarily difficult to watch these changes happening. So, I don't know. I like thinking about how aging itself as a concept is situated within different disciplines, but I also am deeply curious about how people understand their own aging processes and how they not just cope with them, what they make of them.
Well, someone raised their hand. There you go, Lisa.
So what are you picking up on, Patrick?
Two participants raised their hand, then I don't know how you deal with that.
I'm not seeing that on my side.
I am. Two attendees have their hands up if you go under the participants.
Okay. So we'll, Lisa Porter.
Potter.
Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. I'd just like to say, okay, I listened very well to Danielle Dixon. Like, all of you were very great. And maybe I could be one of the voices that speak up, because I was in foster care and group homes, everything. And now I got out, like there was abuse and I got out. And now I'm living in a senior residence, and I'm living with my mom, and I'm doing great. Like, people should have second voices, like a second chance. Like, people should be listened to.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for sharing. Yeah, I mean, there needs to be opportunities for that, right? And we have to encourage governments to kind of take responsibility for that legacy. It's happened in small pockets, but not anywhere near to the extent that it needs to. I mean, there needs to be a recognition that this was something that this country and then the provinces therein authorized and allowed to happen for a very long time.
Are there any other questions? We can open up the chat to speaking if you would prefer to speak your question as opposed to pose it in the question and answer box. Okay. Well, this was fantastic. I wanted to thank, I'd like to thank the speakers, the 4 speakers today, for carving out some time on a Friday afternoon and presenting on each of your contributions to the book. And for staying with us and having this long conversation about aging and ageism. There was a question essay in the chat box, not the question and answer box, but the chat box, about how to get the book, if there's a promotional code. I'll follow up with the registrants about that. We'll have a link to the book, and Patrick, we can connect about codes and so on. Thank you all so much for your presence today and for participating in this panel. If you would like to stay in touch with Engage to sort of keep in the loop on the activities and the events that happen through the center, you can follow us at engage _CU, and you can also join our newsletter, which is available on our website. You can also email me I'm the coordinator at engage@concordia.ca. Have a wonderful weekend and take good care.
Thank you, Tristana. Thank you to all the participants.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.